In a small, quiet town tucked away in the deep south, life moved at its own slow pace. The air was thick with humidity, and the streets were lined with old oak trees that whispered secrets to anyone who cared to listen. Among the townsfolk lived a boy named Elijah, a 16-year-old with deep brown skin and eyes that carried more weight than most boys his age could bear. He wasn't just another teenager trying to find his place in the world. He was a son, a protector, and until recently, someone who believed life would always be predictable. Elijah's world revolved around one person, his mother, Clara. She was everything to him, his anchor, his guide, and his biggest cheerleader. Clara worked long hours as a nurse at the local hospital, often coming home late with tired eyes but a warm smile for her son. Despite their modest lifestyle, they shared a bond so strong that it felt unbreakable. They laughed together over simple meals, talked about dreams bigger than their tiny town, and found joy even in the smallest moments. For Elijah, Clara wasn't just his mom. She was his entire universe. But universes can collapse without warning. One ordinary evening, while Elijah sat on the porch waiting for Clara to return from work, a police car pulled up instead. 2 officers stepped out, their faces grim. Before they even spoke, Elijah's heart sank. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The officers explained that Clara had collapsed at the hospital earlier that day. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Her death was sudden, shocking, and final, a result of an undiagnosed heart condition no one saw coming. The days that followed were a blur of grief and disbelief. Elijah wandered through the house like a ghost, touching objects that still smelled faintly of his mother's perfume. Her favorite chair sat empty, her slippers untouched by the door. Every corner of their home reminded him of her absence. The pain was suffocating, but what made it worse was how quickly the world around him seemed to move on. Neighbors offered condolences with polite nods before returning to their routines. Friends tried to comfort him, but their words felt hollow. Even the funeral home refused to delay Clara's burial due to policy, leaving Elijah feeling powerless and abandoned. As he stood beside her coffin during the wake, Elijah struggled to process the reality of losing her forever. People milled around, murmuring prayers and sharing memories, but all he could focus on was the unnatural stillness of her body. It didn't feel real. How could someone so full of life now be reduced to silence? He wanted to scream, to shake her awake, to beg her to come back. But nothing he did could change the truth staring him in the face. Clara was gone, and there was nothing left for him to hold on to. Yet, amidst the despair, a flicker of hope lingered in Elijah's mind. While eavesdropping on conversations among the elderly church members gathered at the wake, he overheard whispers of old traditions, rituals said to bring peace or even restore life under certain conditions. Though the story sounded far-fetched, they planted a seed of possibility in Elijah's heart. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bring Clara back. And if there was even the slightest chance, Elijah knew he had to try. For the first time, since her passing, he felt something other than despair, determination. As the wake continued, Elijah found himself lingering near a group of elderly church members who had gathered in a quiet corner of the room. Their voices were low, almost secretive, as they shared stories passed down through generations. At first, Elijah wasn't paying much attention. He was too consumed by his grief. But something about their tone caught his ear. It was a mix of reverence and mystery, like they were discussing something sacred, something not meant for just anyone to hear. One woman, her hair streaked with gray and her hands trembling slightly as she held her cane, spoke softly about rituals from long ago. "Back in my grandmother's time," she said, leaning closer to the others, "they believed death wasn't always the end. Sometimes if you acted quickly enough, you could bring someone back." Elijah froze. His heart began to race as he strained to listen without seeming obvious. Another man, older still with deep wrinkles etched into his face, nodded solemnly. "It's true," he added. "There are herbs, special ones, that can call the soul back to the body. But it has to be done within a day or two, before the spirit moves too far away." The group exchanged knowing glances. their expressions a blend of curiosity and caution. Elijah felt a surge of hope rising inside him, fragile but undeniable. Could this be real? Was there truly a way to undo what had happened? He wanted to ask them more, to beg them for details, but he held back, afraid they'd dismiss him or refuse to help. Instead, he stayed quiet, absorbing every word. Later, when the crowd thinned and the room grew quieter, Elijah approached the woman with the cane. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp despite her age. "What is it, child?" she asked gently, sensing his unease. I heard you talking earlier," Elijah stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the herbs. Can they really bring someone back?" The woman studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing yet kind. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "Some say yes, some say no. These things aren't for everyone to understand or to try. But if your heart feels called to it, then perhaps it's worth considering." Her words sent a jolt of determination through Elijah. For the first time since losing his mother, he felt like he had a purpose again. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was impossible, but he couldn't ignore the spark of hope igniting within him. That night, after returning home, Elijah lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in his mind. The idea of reviving Clara seemed both terrifying and exhilarating. What if it worked? What if he could see her smile again, hear her laugh, feel her arms wrap around him? But the elders hadn't given him all the answers. They mentioned herbs, yes, but where would he find them? How would he know which ones to use? And how exactly was he supposed to perform such a ritual? The question swirled in his head, keeping sleep at bay. Still, Elijah refused to let doubt take over. If the herbs existed, he would find them. If the ritual was possible, he would figure it out. He owed it to Clara and to himself to try. The next morning, Elijah set out to learn more. He visited the local library, flipping through dusty books on folklore and herbal medicine. He scoured the internet late into the night, searching for clues that might lead him to the right path. Each new piece of information fueled his resolve, even as it raised more questions. By the third day, he had pieced together fragments of a map, an old legend describing a hidden grove deep in the woods where rare plants grew under the light of the full moon. It sounded mythical, like something out of a fairy tale, but Elijah didn't care. To him, it was a lifeline. With each passing hour, his focus sharpened. Grief no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it drove him forward. Every step he took brought him closer to the chance of seeing his mother again. Though fear lingered at the edges of his mind, Elijah pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to hesitate, not when Clara's life might depend on him. The forest surrounding Elijah's town was dense and wild, a place where few dared to venture after sunset. Tales of strange noises and shadowy figures kept most people away, but Elijah didn't have the luxury of fear. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a small backpack filled with supplies, and the fragment of a map he'd pieced together from old books, he stepped into the woods under the cover of night. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. Every sound, the rustle of branches, the distant hoot of an owl, felt magnified in the darkness, as though the forest itself was watching him. As he moved deeper, the path became harder to follow. Twisted roots snaked across the ground, threatening to trip him at every step. Thorny vines clawed at his arms and legs, leaving tiny scratches that stung but didn't slow him down. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing glimpses of gnarled trees and patches of moonlight filtering through the canopy above. But for all its beauty, the forest felt alive in a way that unnerved him. It wasn't just the rustling leaves or the occasional snap of a twig. It was the weight of the silence between those sounds, heavy and expectant, like it knew why he was there. Hours passed and doubt began to creep into Elijah's mind. What if the grove didn't exist? What if the herbs were nothing more than a myth, a story told to give grieving souls false hope? He shook his head, trying to banish the thoughts. Giving up wasn't an option. Not when Clara's life might depend on what he found here. He pressed on, his determination outweighing his exhaustion. Finally, just when he thought he might collapse from fatigue, he stumbled into a clearing bathed in silvery moonlight. In the center stood a cluster of plants unlike anything he'd ever seen. Their leaves shimmered faintly, almost glowing, and their stems were thick and sturdy. Elijah froze, his breath catching in his throat. This had to be it, the sacred herbs the elders had spoken of. He dropped to his knees, trembling as he reached out to touch one of the leaves. It felt warm beneath his fingertips, pulsing with an energy he couldn't explain. Gathering the herbs was no easy task. They grew close together, their roots buried deep in the soil, and pulling them free required strength and patience. As he worked, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder several times, half expecting to see eyes peering back at him from the shadows. But the forest remained silent, its presence both comforting and unsettling. Once he had enough, Elijah sat back on his heels, his hands stained with dirt and sap. For a moment he allowed himself to rest, gazing up at the sky. The full moon hung low, casting its pale light over the grove. It felt surreal, like he'd crossed into another world entirely. Part of him wondered if this was all a dream. If he'd wake up in his bed heartbroken and empty-handed, but the herbs in his bag were real, their faint glow impossible to deny. With renewed purpose, Elijah packed up and began the journey back. The return trip felt longer, the forest darker, but he clung to the image of Clara's face. She was waiting for him, even if she didn't know it yet. As he walked, he replayed the instructions he'd memorized in his mind. Crush the herbs into a fine powder, mix them with water drawn from a pure source, and chant the words written in the margins of the old book. The ritual sounded simple enough, but Elijah knew better than to underestimate its power or its risks. By the time he emerged from the woods, dawn was breaking, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink. Exhausted but resolute, Elijah headed home to prepare the elixir. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He was ready to face whatever came his way. For Clara, he would do anything, even challenge the boundaries between life and death. The morgue stood at the edge of town, a cold and sterile building that seemed to repel life itself. Its white walls gleamed under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, and the windows were dark like empty eyes staring into the night. Elijah approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been inside a morgue before, but he knew it was the last place anyone wanted to be, especially not alone, especially not after midnight. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The herbs were safely tucked into his bag, their faint glow now hidden from view. All that mattered now was getting inside. Breaking into a morgue wasn't something he'd ever imagined doing, but desperation had pushed him this far. For Clara, he would risk everything. Elijah circled the building slowly, scanning for any sign of security cameras or guards. To his relief, the place appeared deserted. It was an old facility, likely understaffed and underfunded, which worked in his favor. Still, every creak of the wind made him flinch, and every shadow seemed to shift suspiciously. He reminded himself to stay focused. One wrong move, one careless sound, and he'd lose his chance forever. Finally, he found what he was looking for. A side window, slightly ajar, its frame rusted with age. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Carefully, Elijah wedged his fingers beneath the glass and lifted. The window groaned as it moved, the noise piercing through the silence like a scream. He froze, his ears straining for any sign of movement nearby. When nothing happened, he exhaled sharply and hoisted himself up, wincing as his sneakers scraped against the sill. Inside, the air was icy, carrying the sharp scent of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and unsettling. Elijah's flashlight trembled in his hand as he swept the beam across the room. Empty desks, stacks of paperwork, and medical equipment lined the space. Everything was unnaturally clean, almost too perfect, as though the building itself was, trying to erase any trace of humanity. His footsteps echoed softly as he crept down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The walls were lined with notices about health codes and sanitation protocols, reminders of how impersonal death could feel in a place like this. But Elijah couldn't afford to dwell on those thoughts. He needed to find Clara, and fast. At the end of the corridor, a heavy metal door loomed ahead, marked refrigeration unit in bold letters. His stomach churned as he pushed it open, revealing rows of steel drawers stacked neatly against the walls. Each one bore a label, a name scrawled in black ink. Elijah scanned them quickly, his pulse racing faster with each passing second. Then he saw it. Clara Johnson. His hands shook as he reached for the handle. This was it, the moment he'd been working toward since stepping into the forest hours earlier. Yet now that he was here, doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. What if she didn't wake up? What if the ritual failed, or worse, what if it caused harm instead of healing? He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the questions away. There was no turning back now. With trembling fingers, Elijah pulled the drawer open. The metallic slide grated against its track, the sound unbearably loud in the silent room. And then, there she was. His mother, lying still and pale, her features serene but lifeless. Tears welled up in his eyes as he stared at her, overwhelmed by the reality of what he was about to do. She looked so peaceful, like she might simply be sleeping. But he knew better. Her chest didn't rise and fall, her lips didn't part to take a breath. She was gone. For a moment, Elijah hesitated. Was he crazy to think this could work? Was he disrespecting her memory by even trying? But then he remembered why he was here. Not out of selfishness, but out of love. Love drove him forward, even when fear tried to hold him back. Taking a deep breath, Elijah unzipped his bag and retrieved the small vial containing the elixir. The liquid shimmered faintly in the dim light, almost alive in his grasp. He stepped, closer to Clara, tilting her head gently with trembling hands. As he brought the vial to her lips, he whispered her name, his voice breaking. "Mom. Please." The first drop fell onto her tongue, glistening like dew on a petal. Elijah held, his breath waiting for a miracle, for a sign, for anything. For what felt like an eternity, Elijah stood frozen, his eyes locked on Clara's face. The seconds ticked by agonizingly slow, each one stretching into minutes as he waited for something, anything, to happen. His heart thudded in his chest, the sound so loud it drowned out the eerie silence of the morgue. He clutched the vial tightly in his hand, afraid to blink, afraid to breathe, as though even the smallest movement might disrupt whatever magic, or miracle, was supposed to take place. At first, nothing changed. Clara remained still, her body cold and lifeless, her expression peaceful but distant. Doubt crept back into Elijah's mind, whispering cruel truths. What if the herbs were just plants, no different from any other? What if the ritual was nothing more than a story meant to comfort grieving souls, never meant to be real? Tears welled up in his eyes again, blurring his vision. Had he come all this way only to fail? But then, something shifted. So subtle at first that Elijah thought he imagined it. A faint warmth seemed to radiate from Clara's skin where moments ago there had been only icy stillness. He blinked hard, leaning closer, unsure whether his exhaustion was playing tricks on him. Then he saw it. The faintest rise of her chest, almost imperceptible, like the flutter of a butterfly's wings. His breath caught in his throat. "Mom?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling with hope and fear. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids flickered, twitching slightly before slowly opening. For a moment her gaze was unfocused, clouded with confusion, as though she were emerging from a deep sleep. Then her eyes settled on Elijah, recognition dawning in their depths. "Elijah?" she murmured, her voice weak and raspy but unmistakably hers. A sob escaped Elijah's lips as relief crashed over him like a tidal wave. He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, half expecting her to vanish if he let go. "It's me, Mom," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. I'm here. Clara blinked slowly, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Where am I? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her fingers curled around his, weak but warm, a sensation Elijah hadn't dared to hope for just moments earlier. You're safe, Elijah assured her, though his own thoughts were swirling with questions. How much did she remember? Did she know she had died? Should he tell her? He pushed those worries aside for now. All that mattered was that she was awake, alive, at least for the moment. As the initial shock began to wear off, Elijah noticed something strange. Clara's movements were sluggish, her energy drained as though every gesture required immense effort. When she tried to sit up, her body resisted, collapsing back against the steel slab with a soft groan. She looked up at him, her expression filled with both gratitude and bewilderment. I feel different, she admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Elijah nodded, forcing himself to stay calm despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. You've been through a lot, he said gently, choosing his words carefully. Just rest for now. We'll figure everything out later. He helped her sit upright, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders to shield her from the biting cold of the morgue. As he supported her weight, Elijah couldn't help but marvel at the impossible reality unfolding before him. She was alive. But how long would it last? And what price had he paid to bring her back? The weight of these unanswered questions pressed heavily on his shoulders, but Elijah pushed them aside for now. All that mattered was that Clara was with him again, breathing and speaking and holding his hand. Whatever came next, they would face it together. News of Clara's miraculous return spread faster than Elijah could have imagined. By the time they made their way back home in the early hours of the morning, whispers had already begun to ripple through the town. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief as mother and son walked side by side. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers under their breath. A few even approached them cautiously, offering blessings or asking if it was true. Had Clara really come back from the dead? At first, Elijah tried to deflect the attention. He kept his head down, shielding Clara with his body as they hurried inside their small house. But there was no escaping the storm that followed. Within hours, visitors began arriving at their doorstep, curious neighbors, skeptical relatives, and even local reporters eager to document the miracle. The pastor of their church showed up unannounced, his Bible clutched tightly in one hand. His expression was stern, almost accusatory as he demanded an explanation. "This is unnatural," the pastor declared, his voice booming through the tiny living room. "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Who are we to interfere with? His will?" Elijah clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I didn't do this for show," he shot back, his tone sharper than he intended. "I did it because I couldn't let her go. Not like that." Clara sat quietly on the couch, listening to the heated exchange. Her presence alone was enough to silence some of the harshest critics, but not all were convinced. Rumors swirled about witchcraft and forbidden rituals, painting Elijah as reckless or worse, dangerous. Schoolmates who once teased him now stared in fear, crossing the street to avoid him. Even friends who had offered condolences after Clara's death seemed uneasy around him now, unsure whether to celebrate or condemn what had happened. Amidst the chaos, Elijah noticed something unsettling about Clara. Though she was alive, she wasn't quite the same. She moved slowly, her energy fading quickly after even the simplest tasks. Sometimes, she would forget things. Small details at first, like where she'd left her keys or what day of the week it was. But then larger gaps appeared. She struggled to recall entire conversations they'd had just moments earlier, leaving Elijah scrambling to fill in the blanks without alarming her. And then there were the nightmares. Every night, Clara woke screaming, drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with terror. "They're calling me," she whispered one evening, clutching Elijah's arm so tightly it left marks. "Voices, pulling me back." "Back where?" Elijah asked, though he already suspected the answer. Clara shook her head, unable to explain further. Her fear was palpable, and it mirrored Elijah's growing unease. Something wasn't right. Bringing her back hadn't been as simple as pouring liquid into her mouth and watching her wake up. There were consequences, hidden costs he hadn't anticipated. As days turned into weeks, Elijah began to piece together fragments of truth. The herbs, the ritual, the elixir. It wasn't just about reviving life. It was about bending the rules of nature itself. Clara wasn't fully here anymore. Part of her still lingered somewhere else, tethered between worlds. Each passing day felt like borrowed time, a fragile thread holding her to this side of existence. Despite the mounting challenges, Elijah refused to give up. He threw himself into research, scouring books and online forums for answers. How could he stabilize her? Was there a way to anchor her soul completely? But the more he learned, the clearer it became. The ritual had limits. Clara's return was temporary, a gift with an expiration date. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their living room, Elijah finally broke the silence. "Mom," he said softly, his voice cracking with emotion, "I don't know how much time we have left, but I promise you this. I'll make every second count." Clara reached out, placing a trembling hand over his. Her smile was faint, but filled with love. "You've already given me more than I deserved, my boy," she replied. "Don't waste your tears on me. Let's live while we can." In that moment, Elijah realized the truth. It wasn't about fixing what had been broken or undoing the inevitable. It was about cherishing the time they had, together. As the weeks passed, life in the small town grew increasingly tense for Elijah and Clara. The whispers didn't fade. Instead, they grew louder, fueled by fear and superstition. Some townsfolk hailed Elijah as a miracle worker, a chosen one touched by divine intervention or ancient wisdom. Others viewed him with suspicion, convinced that he had tampered with forces beyond human understanding. The divide between these two groups created a palpable tension, turning the once close-knit community into factions. The local pastor continued to preach against them, delivering sermons that condemned their actions as unnatural. "What lies beneath cannot be undone without consequence," he thundered from the pulpit one Sunday morning. His words echoed through the church, sending shivers down the spines of those who attended. Though neither Elijah nor Clara went to hear him speak, the message reached them anyway. Through gossip, furtive glances, and even anonymous notes slipped under their door. One note read simply, "She doesn't belong here anymore." Clara tried to ignore the hostility, but it weighed on her heavily. She spent most of her days indoors, avoiding prying eyes and harsh stares. When she ventured outside, people either avoided her altogether or crossed themselves when she walked by. It was clear they saw her not as a person, but as something otherworldly, a ghost brought back to haunt the living. Even children, who once ran up to greet her with smiles, now hid behind their parents' legs, pointing and whispering. Elijah bore the brunt of the backlash. At school, his classmates alternated between treating him like a celebrity and ostracizing him entirely. Teachers watched him closely, unsure how to handle the situation. One day during lunch, a group of boys cornered him near the lockers. "You think you're some kind of god?" one sneered, shoving him lightly. "Bringing people back from the dead? That's messed up, man." Elijah didn't fight back. He simply stared at them, his jaw clenched until they lost interest and wandered off. Inside, though, he burned with frustration. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he'd wanted was more time with his mother, to say the things left unsaid, to share laughter and memories they'd been robbed of too soon. Now, every step forward felt like 2 steps back. But the hardest part wasn't the judgment or the isolation. It was watching Clara struggle. Her moments of clarity became fewer, her energy dwindling with each passing day. Sometimes she seemed almost normal, cooking meals or reminiscing about old stories. Other times, she drifted away, her gaze distant as if listening to voices only she could hear. On several occasions, Elijah found her standing at the edge of the woods behind their house, staring into the trees as though searching for something, or someone. One evening, after another restless night filled with nightmares, Clara turned to Elijah with tears in her eyes. "I can feel it pulling me," she confessed, her voice trembling. "It's getting stronger. I don't know how much longer I can stay." Elijah's heart sank, but he forced himself to remain calm. "We'll figure it out," he promised, though deep down he knew the truth. The ritual had given them a second chance, but it wasn't permanent. Clara's body might have returned, but her spirit was still caught between worlds, fighting to hold on. Determined to make the most of their remaining time, Elijah threw himself into creating new memories with her. They visited places they'd always meant to explore but never had. The lake where Clara used to swim as a child, the farmer's market downtown, the little park where Elijah played soccer as a kid. They laughed, cried, and talked late into the nights, filling the silence with everything they'd missed saying before. Through it all, Clara remained grateful, her love for her son unwavering. "You gave me a gift," she told him one evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. "No matter what happens next, I'll always be proud of you." Her words brought Elijah both comfort and pain. He knew she was preparing him for her eventual departure, for the loneliness that would follow. But he also knew she was right. Love wasn't about holding on forever. It was about cherishing the moments you had while they lasted. And despite everything, Elijah was determined to do just that. The final days with Clara were bittersweet, a delicate balance of joy and sorrow that Elijah carried in his heart like a fragile treasure. Together, they created memories that felt both fleeting and eternal, moments so vivid they seemed to stretch time itself. They baked her favorite recipes, filling the house with the warm scent of cinnamon and vanilla. They danced in the living room to old records, laughing until their sides hurt. And on quiet evenings, they sat side by side under the stars, talking about everything and nothing, as if trying to pack an entire lifetime into a few precious weeks. But even amidst these beautiful moments, the pull Elijah had feared became undeniable. Clara grew weaker, her energy fading faster each day. She began spending more time asleep, her dreams restless and haunted. When she was awake, her eyes often wandered, searching for something unseen. One afternoon, while sitting in her favorite chair, she reached out suddenly, grasping at the air as though trying to catch something just beyond her reach. "They're calling me again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's time." Elijah froze, his chest tightening as he realized what she meant. He wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't fear or regret. It was acceptance. Clara had always been strong, and now she faced this moment with the same quiet courage that had defined her life. That night, they stayed up late, holding hands as the world outside grew still. Clara spoke, softly, sharing stories from her childhood and offering advice Elijah would carry with him forever. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And don't let anyone tell you how to live your life. You've got a good heart, my boy. Trust it." When morning came, Clara didn't wake up. Her breathing slowed throughout the night until it finally stilled, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the whole world held its breath. Elijah sat beside her for a long time, holding her hand and letting the weight of his grief settle over him. This time there were no herbs, no rituals, no desperate attempts to change what couldn't be changed. She was gone, but not lost. Not truly. In the days that followed, Elijah found solace in the memories they'd made during those final weeks. The laughter, the conversations, the simple acts of love. They were all pieces of Clara that would remain with him forever. Though the town continued to whisper, Elijah chose to rise above it. He began speaking openly about his journey, not to justify what he'd done, but to share the lessons he'd learned. Grief, he told anyone who would listen, wasn't something to fix. It was something to carry. Love didn't end with death. It evolved, finding new ways to exist in the spaces left behind. Over time, the hostility toward Elijah softened. Some people apologized for their harsh words, admitting they hadn't understood the depth of his love for Clara. Others remained skeptical, but Elijah didn't mind. He knew the truth. What he'd done hadn't been about proving anything to anyone. It had been about giving himself and Clara one last chance to say goodbye. As months passed, Elijah discovered a new purpose. He started volunteering at the local hospital where Clara had worked, helping patients and their families navigate the hardest moments of their lives. His presence brought comfort to those who needed it most, a reminder that even in loss, there could be light. Clara's absence was a wound that never fully healed, but it also became a source of strength. Elijah carried her memory with him everywhere he went, letting her love guide him through challenges and triumphs alike. On quiet nights when the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, he sometimes imagined her watching over him, smiling softly as she had always done. And though Elijah knew he'd never see her again, not in this life, he also knew one thing. For certain, love wasn't bound by time or space. It lived in the moments shared, the lessons taught, and the hearts touched along the way. And in that way, Clara was still very much alive, in his heart, in his actions, and in the legacy of kindness she had inspired.